Today I'm going to be talking about the most contrarian productivity book in 2024, and maybe it's the most contrarian one I've ever read. You can tell how contrarian it is. Just look at this picture of productivity books and management books and all these types of things I had around my house. Can you guess just from this picture which one we'll be talking about today? It is, obviously this one, Slow Productivity by Cal Newport. It's his brand new book. You probably know him by Deep Work, which was, a very popular productivity book. But as we dive into this, I guess I should just first address kind of the elephant in the room for the cliche that it is. Because last time I reviewed a productivity book, some people commented and asked, why do we even care about what an economist, a professional economist, I'm an economics professor, just to make sure people understand that coming into this video. Why do we care what an economics professor has to say about a productivity book? I have a couple of responses to that. One, here is a picture of Nobel laureates. Both of these guys have received a Nobel Prize in economics, and I think they capture the essence of this book just in this picture. And probably if we looked at their whole lives, I would have to go back to that and check that out. But I wanted to put that picture up there because I feel like Cal would be really interested in seeing that picture. It came out this week because Daniel Kahneman, the one on the left in this picture, he passed away, and Dick Thaler, the one on the right, put that picture out there to kind of memorialize one of his best friends. But, what is an economist going to contribute to our discussion here? And there are two responses to this, one specific to this book, which I'm going to dive into, but let me give the general response as well. And that is, economists care a lot about productivity. You could say productivity is one of the, core areas of study of economics. In fact, we've come through macroeconomics and growth theory to understand that most economic growth comes from increasing productivity. Speaking of Nobel Prizes, just a couple of years ago, the Nobel Prize went to, oh my goodness, I'm blanking on his name right now. It's right here. His role in understanding productivity. And really, most things that you hear about around economic studies are trying to understand productivity or efficiencies. And if there's some sort of discrimination, some sort of gap, that is a fault of productivity, economists are interested in trying to remedy that, right? That is the essence of the entire economy. And of course, that's going to narrow into individuals being productive. But for this book in particular, I think it's important that an economist comes in and gives a little context behind what Cal is arguing here, because he has this concept, defines in a nice little box right here, that he calls pseudo productivity. And this concept can sound a little weird and might sound uneconomical. The question is this possible to exist as an economic concept? In fact, I've been listening to his podcasts around the time of this publication, and some people pushed back with some economic arguments saying it doesn't seem like this is a really sound economic argument. So I'm going to dive into what I think are some of the good things about this book, as I also talk about some of the economics and economic history that go behind the concepts that I think help support his book. So I'm going to try and make the best case for his book. I liked it. I'll just put that out there right now. Let me make the best case for it. And one of the ways that you can think about this is thinking about yourself. Imagine you're living decades ago, possibly a century ago, looking around as an economist, and you probably have some pipe, I don't know what economists were doing a century ago, and you're just thinking about the market economy. You've got the Wealth of Nations cracked open on your nice coffee table, and you're thinking about the invisible hand, because the questions of socialism and communism are up right now, and Adam Smith, centuries before that, said, hey, one of the great things about economies is that they direct resources towards their most efficient use. And it's not through any sort of planning. It's not through any sort of benevolence. It's as if an invisible hand is guiding the economy and directing things to their highest and most best value use. But there's something that is not sitting well for you, because you're sitting there and thinking, look at the economy. Yes, I agree that it's amazing that markets and the economy are able to produce all of this without central planning, but what is actually producing that? You have the people buying things, and you have people selling things, but it's not individuals selling things. What you realize is that the market is made up of a bunch of firms, a bunch of businesses. And when you crack open the top of those businesses and look into it, you realize that those businesses are not run like a market. Like, if a market is the most efficient way to run the economic system, why don't businesses run in that way? Businesses do not say, hey, we have a job that we're looking for, and, please get this done. We're going to pay people for this job today. And the next day they open up another spot market in labor and just try and fill jobs every day. No, that's not how these things work. Businesses work as tiny little centrally planned economies. You have a manager, or you have a CEO who has managers who have their own managers. I don't know how many levels there are. I'm an academic. I don't work in a real business. But eventually you get to the workers, and then everyone's managing each other, and it's all centrally planned. And that kind of flies in the face of this logic that that the market and just free markets and prices are the best way to allocate things, when the actual individuals or the actors in it are centrally planned. It's almost like you're sitting there in this as an economist in your study with the Wealth Nations open and thinking like a physicist, where there's this disconnect between what happens in the big world and what happens on this micro scale. It's like you're discovering quantum theory and you're trying to reconcile this fact that gravity doesn't work at that level. Markets, which are like almost this gravitational force, maybe you could say electromagnetic force, whatever, it's not working the way you would expect, given that it's so efficient in the other places. And so you're trying to come up with an explanation for this. Why do firms exist? Why are they centrally planned? Well, if you are thinking this, you might be Ronald Coase, who ends up winning a Nobel Prize for some of his contributions in trying to understand this puzzle. Coase says is that, hey, when we run markets, they aren't run for free. Anytime you have to go find a product and pay a price, there are search costs, there are information costs. Broadly speaking, there are transaction costs. And running that just constantly every day means that as you do each transaction, you have these costs that accumulate, and it can really dampen how much economic activity you do, because the real cost of doing this is higher than the market price. The example I like to use is like a supermarket where there's a spill on aisle 9. And what you could do is just, when you say there's a spill on aisle 9, you could announce, we're looking for someone to clean up aisle 9. The going price right now is $5. Do I hear $4, right? Yeah, obviously $5 would be pretty expensive for a pretty quick clean, but find some way to auction that off, get the winner, the person who's willing to go do it, and then they go clean it up. That's not how it works. They say, clean up aisle 7, and they say, hey, Matt, can you get in there? And somebody, that central planner, sends them there. In this Coase theory of the firm, what Coase is saying is, if they were to try and do these spot market auctions and trying to find somebody to clean up aisle 7 every time there's a mess, that's a lot of transaction costs. You're going to have to find someone, to pay them. And Coase probably isn't thinking exactly of this, but like all the legal issues of like getting a W-4 or W-2, whatever the legal form is, trying to hire them, all those costs that come into it end up just making it so that the market mechanism isn't worth it. You'd rather have somebody on hand sitting around doing nothing a lot of the time. You can observe that. You go to a Walmart, you look around, you're like, it feels like there's a lot of people just standing around, just talking to each other. I experienced this working at a movie theater in high school. Like, most of the time, it was us just standing around, and then there were periods where all the movies got out at the same time, they had to be cleaned, and then all the next movies were starting at the same time, so those people had to have concessions sold to them, and then you had about that, sometimes an hour, sometimes up to 2 hours, where there was nothing getting done, and we just sat around. And sometimes you try to busy yourself and try to be a good employee, and you go and do a little bit of work, which is going to come into play in this book. But for the most part, like, it's short periods of a lot of work followed by long periods of not much work. And Coase would say yes, because the transaction cost of trying to find those workers and get everything going every time those movies get in and out would just be so astronomically high. You'd rather hire some of these people and pay them to sit around and do nothing, because it lowers the transaction cost of trying to find them in the first place. Then the next people that I want to think of are the ones that are proposing a different theory of the firm that's related to this, and that is Armin Alshin and Harold Demsetz, who are thinking about the same problem. And they're like, is that really the transaction cost? Is that the best explanation of what the transaction costs behind a firm are? And they say, you know what? Firms are actually engaged in what's called team production. Think about this with a project at school. And the idea is, there is a team, and they each have to contribute a different part to this project. And the end of this time, that project will be submitted. Or in a market case, that end product is going to be sold. But it's the work of a whole team behind it. And firms come about when there is team production, which is each worker is not contributing just their own work. They're having some sort of spillover effect on other workers. They're making each other more productive. And by making each other more productive, you cannot separate out what each worker did, because each worker's contribution is their contribution plus the contribution they received from everybody else working on it and the contribution they made to everybody else's work. And so the market cannot properly attribute credit to marginal productivities. I feel like I'm getting like way too in the weeds on these actual terms. What I mean is, like, normally we hire you for the work that you do. The problem is we don't know how much work you did and how much you contributed to the rest of it. A good way to think about this is like basketball. There's a star player, he's out there, he's producing a lot, but you have to take into account not just what that star player is doing, but also like how that star player affects the rest of the team. LeBron James brings the defense to him, freeing up other players on his team. He's able to pass it to them. They're more productive because he's on the court. And when he leaves the court, those players become less productive. There's actual economic research showing this on basketball courts, where individual players raise the productivity of the entire team. How do you properly compensate for this? Well, what happens is you hire a manager. You have a firm with a manager, and the manager is responsible for watching everybody's productivity and making sure that nobody is shirking. Because when there's team production and when it's hard for you to attribute how much work is done by each member of the team, some members of the team are going to have an incentive to shirk. I know this is going to be a surprise to you for those of you who have worked on group projects in school, but like your group might have been a special group and didn't have a shirker, but sometimes, and by sometimes a lot of the time, people on group projects do not all equally contribute to these group projects. But when you look at the final product, it's hard to tell which ones were the ones who contributed to the project. And it's the same for the market. A lot of things went into producing this book, but like I do not know how much the editor contributed to this, how much the publisher and the printer and all those. I don't know their individual contributions to this. I just bought the final product. Somebody else is taking care of rewarding each member of that team. And that somebody else is a manager of some sort. That's why there's a centrally planned part of our economy in these firms. They are trying to attribute credit and rewards to the people who are working because we want them to have incentives to work. And so the market cannot properly reward them. We are going to give a manager that central planning authority. That's where the ideas for pseudo productivity come in. So pseudo productivity, as Cal defines it, is the use of visible activity as the primary means of approximating actual productive effort. So what he's saying is it's really hard for people to observe the actual contributions that workers are making to the entire team and to the output of the team. So managers are using visible activity to attribute to productivity. But the problem is visible activity is a lot like exhaust. The actual work and the effort that you do goes and produces the thing that you want to produce, right? There's some sort of connection between your working process, and there's like a lot of things that contribute to that. There's sitting down at a computer and typing away or looking at data, but there's also going on a walk and thinking about these ideas for the first time, or like really mulling on it, or having a conversation with someone, or you know what, doing the dishes, taking a shower, right? Like lots of times our best ideas come at those moments when we're not intensely focused on it and we're doing something completely unrelated. But some of those efforts produce visible activity, things that I can see. I can see people sitting at their computer and doing work. And so managers initially were just using the visible work. You show up at work, you're there all day. I'm pretty confident that you're actually contributing to the team. And I think what Cal is saying is that over time, there became a looser connection. It's like our engines became more efficient and didn't produce as much exhaust. And we could produce the output through the input and not have to have so many visible things to that. Like our production process didn't create as much visible activity, right? We had it's knowledge work, we're thinking a lot, and so you don't have to be constantly producing something visible to actually be producing something valuable. But here's the problem. Managers who are now in charge of paying people for their productivity need some way to assess your productivity. And what they've always used is visible activity. They've always looked at the exhaust. And when you reduce your exhaust, they don't take into account that you're just more efficient. They just think that you're not being as productive. And so pseudo productivity is this idea of you are getting paid for the exhaust you produce. And so even though there's a more efficient way to do this, you choose the ways that produce the most exhaust. So that way you can get the compensation that you need. And it's encouraged through the whole incentive system. Now, that's kind of a little bit of the economic history of this, right? Like, there are people who got Nobel Prizes for this, and arguably, Alshian and Demsetz should have gotten Nobel Prizes as well. So there's a huge, huge economic background to what Cal is talking about. In fact, when Cal was talking about this, I don't know if he cites it in this book, but I know that in his discussions, he was citing the work of an economic historian. This is Alfred Chandler, The Visible Hand. The Visible Hand, I mean, it's funny that he calls it visible work, and his book is called The Visible Hand. It's not the same visible. That's not whether the visible hand is referring to what I talked about with Adam Smith and the invisible hand. The invisible hand was this, market force, some like mysterious thing, as if an invisible hand is guiding everything. And what he says is, though there's a visible hand, there's managers who go around and direct everything. We can see them moving everything around. So Alfred Chandler's book, The Visible Hand, was an influence and inspiration for this book. He's mentioned this on his podcast. It's not me just conjecturing. I know that he's read this book. So there's some of that economic, I always say economic history. What I mean is history of economic thought behind the foundation for his book. Is there evidence that this is what actually happens? Now, one of the things I really like about Cal's book is that this is not one of those, this is part of the contrarian nature of it, though it's a subtle contrarian part. He doesn't go through and cite a bunch of studies to say, and researchers at Harvard University found that you do this and it creates this, made them this much more productive, right? I already went on a little tangent on this on another review, but like, I hate that books do that nowadays, because a lot of those studies are garbage, and I just don't think they're that useful for understanding productivity. Cal is doing a lot of case studies. I think that's a great way to do this. Again, I brought this up in this other book, and I got some pushback on it in the comments. I don't understand why. Because the example I gave was like, hey, we have teachings from Jesus about, how to live a good life. And it's not Jesus sitting there saying, well, psychologists at the University of Jerusalem found that if we, take a certain amount of steps on the Sabbath, it's going to increase our life happiness, right? That's not what Jesus was doing. Jesus was telling stories, and those stories were preserved to today. And there's a reason why. Those stories are effective at teaching these principles. Cal is also using stories to teach his principles. Why are they so effective? I think it's because it's easier for us to take those stories and see, one, that there are real people doing these things, and two, that you can extract the principles for yourself and say oh, that's a story that resonates for me, and I think I can apply those principles in my life. I like what he did with the stories. I like that he didn't cite a bunch of research. I, however, am now going to cite some research. And I know I just said I don't like this, but what I'm going to give is not pop psychology, just silly research to see on productivity. I'm going to look at big studies that help us understand what Cal is talking about here. And what's really surprising is one of them is even going to tell you that smoking might help you get promoted faster than if you were not smoking. But let's start off with just this really cool big experiment that was done in China. So this was not college students coming to a lab, hey, let's see what happens when you touch a stuffed animal and how much work you get done. This was a randomized control experiment. They are trying to see what the effect of working from home is on productivity. You know what's amazing about this? This experiment was run in 2015. Actually, the paper was published in 2015, which means the experiment was run years before that, way before COVID. Super fascinating how this team was looking at working from home before it was even a thing. So super interesting what they found. They had this big Chinese company that was looking at working from home. I believe they had phone calls. It was kind of like a call center type thing. And they randomly selected employees and gave them the work from home option, and then left everybody else in the office. And then they measured performance for the workers who were at home and the workers who were in the office. And they found that the workers who were at home increased their productivity by 13%. That's a pretty significant increase in productivity. And they even were able to deduce why their productivity increased. And it was that they were taking fewer breaks. I think the measure was 9% fewer breaks. They're not being interrupted by their colleagues as much. They don't feel as much need to go to the bathroom. I guess, I don't know. They're distracted less. On top of that, it seemed like they enjoyed their jobs more. Attrition was lower. They were 50% more likely to stay at their job because they enjoyed being there, right? Now you have all this flexibility. People have seen this, right? We're seeing this with the rise of work from home. People enjoy those jobs. They want to have them. But there was a downside. With all the upside, with just how amazing this was at increasing productivity, at keeping workers there, reducing distractions, there was a downside. And you maybe are experiencing this downside. I don't know if you're a remote worker, or if you're considering remote work, or you have friends in this area. you might have already heard that there's a downside to this. When the Economist looked at these workers' advancement through the company, when they compared those who had been randomly chosen to work from home and those who had been randomly chosen to stay in the office, they found that the ones that are working from home were 50% less likely to be promoted in this company. That speaks to pseudo productivity, because if managers are primarily evaluating workers based on visible activity, and the visible activity is being done at home and not in the office, then they're not going to give proper assessments to the people working from home. And this is an amazing example of this, because the workers at home were 13% more productive. That's a significant gap. That is a serious difference in productivity. And yet it's the ones that are at home who are not getting promoted. It's the ones in the office who are less productive, but who are in front of their managers who are getting promoted. That seems right in line with what Cal's saying about pseudo productivity. Well, now let's move on to what I said about smoking. Can smoking help you get promoted? Well, there's another really interesting study on this. I think it was a single company, but a really large company. And the economists analyzing this company wanted to know how people were able to advance through their connections to managers. And what they did is they went and surveyed this company. And among other things, they asked who were smokers and who were non-smokers. And they were able to look at managers and they were able to look at employees. And these managers cycle through the company and they kind of get moved around from place to place through their own advancement or whatever. And what they looked at is when a manager who smokes arrives at a new location, how does that affect the employees at that location? And what they find is that employees who smoke were more likely to be promoted. Why are the smokers getting promoted faster? Well, because these smokers, the employees who smoked, and the manager who smoked would take their cigarette breaks together. They'd go out and they would smoke. And this was an opportunity for them to bond, for them to have face-to-face time. And maybe bonding might be too deep of a description, but maybe they're talking about work. They're asking questions about how things are going on. They get to know the families a little bit, right? They have this highly visible aspect of their work as they're talking to these people. And so when promotions come around and those managers are thinking like, who are the workers that I saw the most? The ones who are on cigarette breaks with them are the ones who are coming to mind, and they get promoted faster, right? In this case, I made that analogy to productivity or, visible productivity being exhaust, and like we've become more efficient. Like this is literally it, right? The employees who have exhaust coming out of their mouth are the ones who are getting promoted because it looks like they're at work more often. I remember them more often. So these are studies that corroborate the principle that Cal has in this book, saying pseudo productivity is when we overcompensate workers for their visible activity. And it provides this incentive for people to be more visible in their work or do the things that generate that exhaust because they want to be promoted. They want to advance. They want to get that extra compensation package. But that's not the thing that is most productive for the company. And that's why, why doesn't, the market just wipe these things out? I mean, we get principal agent problems. We have limited information. Like there's a lot of things that come in that make these markets imperfect. And so, managers are probably doing their best. Managers probably don't even realize that they're making these mistakes, but they are. And we respond to those mistakes and we say, I better be doing work that's visible. And I mean, I see that as a professor. I have two main responsibilities as a professor. I need to do research and I need to teach. But the problem is my teaching effort is basically invisible. Sure, you can come in and like see how a class goes every once in a while, but as long as there's no major complaints, no one in my university knows how my teaching is going on a day-to-day basis. I could be awful. I could not even be showing up to class. Nobody really knows because it's hard to see what's going on there. The only things you see are the problems. So when I'm being considered for advancement, the things they see are my research. Am I publishing papers? Am I getting cited? Am I getting invited to talk at other universities? And so the thing that makes the biggest difference for most professors in their advancement is whether they're doing research. Are they getting those publications out? And so it's much easier to count publications than it is to observe someone's teaching. And that's why a lot of professors who are amazing researchers and produce a ton of research don't end up being very great teachers. This is why we've recently seen a lot of professors who have been creating fraudulent studies, because the visible part, those papers, those publications, that's what matters for the actual job. It's not any of the research behind it, right? The research behind it isn't seen, it's invisible. And so guess what? I don't have to actually do it. I just have to get the output out there. I have to convince people that I did the visible part, and I get rewarded for it. And so it's created this incentive to create visible signs of work without actually doing the real work behind it. I'm becoming more and more convinced of the pseudo productivity hypothesis the longer I talk in this video. Hopefully it's clear to you. I don't know. You can let me know if you've seen pseudo productivity in your life, in your job, in the things, right? Like, just go ahead and comment below. I'll also link to those studies in my Substack. I'll put a link to my Substack, and I'll create a little summary of those studies, so that way you can find them if you're interested in them. So Cal has like 3 main pieces of advice for what you can do to get at slow productivity, and he provides like economic theory, economic ideas behind these. In fact, the ideas that he's essentially espousing are the ideas of a Nobel Prize winning economist as well. So the 3 things he says are: do fewer things, work at a natural pace, human pace, and then relentlessly pursue quality. I'm probably not even getting that right. Let me see what it says. Do fewer things, work at a natural pace, obsess over quality, right? Solid advice. I really liked the advice he gave. I felt like it. Again, I when I reviewed a productivity book in the past, I was kind of like, like the ideas, they weren't that inspiring, kind of things I had seen before and things that I thought weren't that great. These ones, I've seen some of this advice before, so maybe I wasn't super impressed by what's going on there, but I think it's given in good ways. I think the case studies behind it, fantastic. Like I said, really help you draw the lessons. I mean, if we want to talk about the economics of what he's recommending, we really just need to talk about children. That's what we should be talking about, because this all comes down to what Gary Becker said. So Gary Becker was an economist at Chicago, won a Nobel Prize for some of the stuff that I'm about to talk about. He was looking at how families, children, are an economic decision. People choose to have families, and they choose how many children to have. And the question is, why do some families choose to have 2 kids? Why do some decide to have 4? Why are some insane and have 6? And his theory came down to this trade-off that you have at the number of kids, right? Because you have a certain amount of income, and you have to support those kids with your income. And of course, you're going to be able to adjust that income in some ways, but you're going to be spending that income on those kids. And so there are 2 things that you can have. You can get utility, you can get enjoyment from the number of kids you have, right? Like more kids, happier family. Or you can get enjoyment from how the quality of your kids, and this is how economists are just like super great parents, because they're talking about the quality of children. But the quality of children is something like, we want to let them take piano lessons and go to college and have all these experiences. They're going to develop skills, and so they'll be higher quality kids if they develop those things. It's just, I already feel so bad saying this when I think of my kids, because the conclusions from this are going to make you worry about my kids. You can get enjoyment from raising the quality of your kids, or enjoyment from having more kids. And so Becker says the number of kids you have is basically the trade-off that you're willing to make between quality and quantity. Do I want more kids who are like lower quality on average, or would I prefer to have fewer kids who are higher quality on average? Because quality is coming from that income that you're spending on those kids, right? Piano lessons cost money, and so if I need to put 6 kids through piano lessons, that's going to be really expensive. 2 kids, much easier to do. I get higher quality kids as a result, right? That's what he's looking at. Cal, in his explanation of being productive, is basically saying there's a quality-quantity trade-off in the things that you do. When you take on more and more projects, you cannot get all those projects done at high quality. So you then have to have lower average quality on those projects. And he even brings in fixed costs, another economic concept, the idea being every project you take on has its own fixed costs, and those fixed costs pile up and take up all your time. So what he says is, hey, stop going for quantity, you need to go for quality. Reduce the number of kids you have, these are the number of projects. Make sure that you're putting the proper investment in that and raise the quality of it. Put the resources in that make it so it's a high quality output. I don't have any fundamental disagreements with the advice there. I totally see it. I mean, I'm in a problem myself where I've taken on way too many research projects. And so I can only work on so many at one time, right? Like, I cannot do all the work I need for all the projects I have going right now. And so I've had to pare back. Those projects still exist. They're just on the back burner right now to make sure that I finish the projects that are most important before I get on to that next one. So, the practicality of the advice hits home. As an economist, I can say stamp of approval on the types of things that you do there. Do I recommend this as a book? Yeah, I think as like a general productivity book, I've been more impressed with this. It helped me think through the history of economic thought on these ideas. So I think he has pretty sound base that he's working from, and that is watch out for visible productivity, that pseudo productivity, the exhaust that you're creating, and model your life after these Nobel laureates, right? Dan Kahneman and Dick Thaler, who look like they're not working, right? They're just, Kahneman doesn't even have shoes on. They're just chatting, probably having ideas just floating around, but they're not sitting at a computer. They're not doing that visible part of work. They're doing that essential part of getting things done. And I think that's a big part of why both of them have won Nobel Prizes. And so, maybe we should be taking his advice more seriously.